ECOWAS never sent troops to stop 3 successful coups. Yet they mobilized for 1 failed attempt. That is not normal. Something in West Africa shifted on December 7, and it shifted fast, too fast to be explained by the usual speeches about defending democracy. A few soldiers walked into a television station in Cotonou, declared the president removed, suspended the constitution, and closed the borders. It looked like the beginning of a familiar story. But within hours, the plot snapped shut. The coup collapsed so quickly it barely had time to breathe. And then, almost instantly, ECOWAS moved with a level of urgency we have never seen before. Not a warning. Not a condemnation. An order. Deploy troops. Tonight. To Benin. Why Benin? Why this attempt? Why now, after years of inaction in the Sahel where governments actually fell? You do not need to be a geopolitical analyst to feel that something about this response does not add up. Because when institutions react this fast, it usually means they are not protecting principles. They are protecting something, or someone, else. If this is the part of the story they hope you ignore, leave a like. On the morning of December 7, soldiers led by Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Tigri seized Benin's state broadcaster and announced that President Patrice Talon had been removed. They suspended the constitution, closed the borders, and reportedly took 2 senior officers hostage. Gunfire echoed across parts of Cotonou, and for a moment, it seemed the coup had momentum. But by midday, everything unraveled. The Interior Minister declared the attempt foiled, and Talon appeared on television, calm and in control, promising consequences for what he called treachery. Then came the moment no one expected. ECOWAS issued an immediate deployment order, real troops, real mobilization, in less than 24 hours. Something larger than Benin was being defended that day. To understand why ECOWAS reacted with unprecedented speed, you have to step back from the morning chaos in Cotonou and look at the tectonic shifts happening across West Africa during the past 5 years. What happened in Benin did not begin in Benin. It began the moment the traditional political order of the region started to crack, one capital at a time. Between 2019 and 2025, more than 10 attempted military takeovers swept the continent. Analysts began calling it the coup belt, a band stretching from Guinea in the west through Mali and Burkina Faso, cutting across Niger and reaching Sudan. The pattern was predictable: frustrated junior officers, collapsing public trust, accusations of corruption, states weakened by insecurity, and governments seen as too close to former colonial powers. In each case, the military stepped in and framed itself as the corrective force. Some attempts failed. Many succeeded. When Niger fell in 2023, it was not just another headline. It was a fracture in the regional architecture. ECOWAS issued threats, ultimatums, sanctions, and even announced a military intervention that never happened. The alliance blinked. And the moment it blinked, the old order snapped. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger walked out of ECOWAS completely, formed their own alliance, realigned militarily toward Russia, and began openly challenging Western economic and security influence. By late 2025, ECOWAS was not just weaker, it was cornered. That is the backdrop to the Benin coup attempt. Not a single act of rebellion, but the next domino in a sequence that had already begun to reshape the region's entire power map. Inside Benin, the tension had been building long before December 7. President Patrice Talon had faced persistent accusations of tightening his grip on power, restricting opposition, changing electoral rules, and reshaping institutions in ways critics argued were simply a softer form of constitutional capture. West Africans have a name for this type of thing: not a coup with guns, but a coup with pens. The African Union's own research categorizes it as an unconstitutional change of government. Just as serious as a military takeover. Yet this type almost never triggers the same outrage from regional bodies. And Benin was no exception. Within parts of the military, the frustration was palpable. Some officers believed the government had become increasingly insulated, increasingly controlled by a small elite, increasingly unresponsive to growing economic dissatisfaction. When Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Tigre and his men stormed the state broadcaster, they were not acting in a vacuum. They were responding to a political climate that had been quietly fermenting for years. As institutions hardened and trust eroded. But the context is larger than Benin's internal dynamics. The country's geography places it at the hinge point between the Sahel and the coast, between the crumbling order of the interior and the fragile stability of the shoreline. Benin is a gate. It connects coastal trade corridors to the Sahel's inland networks. It links ports to regional supply routes. It sits at the interface between ECOWAS's survival and its collapse. And ECOWAS knew it. The alliance knew that if the coup belt, which had already taken Niamey, Ouagadougou, Bamako, Conakry, and Khartoum, were to slide further south, the coastal states would be exposed. Togo, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, even Nigeria. These states were watching the Benin situation not as an isolated crisis, but as a test case. If a coup succeeded in Cotonou, the psychological and strategic consequences would ripple instantly across the entire coastline. This is where the internal dynamics of ECOWAS become central. Over the years, the bloc developed a reputation for selective enforcement. When elected presidents manipulated constitutions to stay in power, ECOWAS often said nothing. When incumbents refused to concede elections, ECOWAS sometimes sent quiet diplomatic notes but avoided hard measures. But when soldiers took power, especially in states drifting away from Western partners, the alliance reacted visibly. The message was clear: ECOWAS would tolerate certain kinds of political distortions, but not others. And that raises the uncomfortable question: was the alliance defending democracy? Or was it defending incumbency? The speed of the Benin response seems to suggest the latter. Democracies do not usually deploy regional battalions within hours of a failed coup. Power structures do. If you think this reaction was too fast to be coincidence and too coordinated to be instinct, you might not be wrong. And if you believe this was intentional, designed to send a message, tell me in the comments. Because the deeper you look, the more you realize that ECOWAS's problem is not only military takeovers. Its problem is legitimacy. Each coup in the Sahel exposed how fragile the democratic project had become. Each failed intervention exposed how limited ECOWAS's real authority was. Each sanction regime pushed ordinary people into poverty while leaving elite networks intact. By 2025, the alliance could no longer afford another humiliation. And that is why Benin became a red line. An attempted coup in the Sahel could be punished with sanctions. But an attempted coup in the coastal belt, where ports sit, where Western militaries operate, where economic interests converge, could not be allowed to stand, even for a day. Especially not when the alliance was already losing credibility and membership at a historic rate. When Tigre's men took the broadcaster, they were trying to overthrow a president. But unintentionally, they triggered something much larger: ECOWAS's instinct for self-preservation. The alliance was not responding to the fall of a government. It was responding to the threat of losing the last pillars of its influence. And that is why minute by minute, the reactions came not just from Benin, but from Abuja, Accra, Abidjan, and even Paris and Washington. Because what was at stake was not only the stability of Benin, but the future alignment of an entire region already splitting into two competing blocs. By the time the coup collapsed, the political message had already been delivered, and not by the soldiers, but by ECOWAS itself. The truth is simple: coups are rarely just about the men carrying guns. They are about the systems behind them, the interests watching them, and the alliances that stand to lose everything if a single capital falls. Inside ECOWAS, 3 countries shape nearly every major decision: Nigeria, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire. They provide most of the bloc's military power, most of its economic weight, and most of the diplomatic pressure behind its enforcement mechanisms. These states have their own reasons for fearing a coup in Benin. Nigeria faces an overstretched military. Insurgencies in the north, and a political class terrified of any spark that could embolden ambitious officers. Ghana, once a symbol of West African democratic stability, has seen rising tensions and erosion of trust in electoral institutions. Côte d'Ivoire, still haunted by its civil conflicts, knows how fast a political tremor can become a national fracture. For them, the Benin Coup attempt was not just an attack on a neighbor. It was a warning shot into the heart of their own systems. If a group of mid-level officers could storm a broadcaster and declare the president removed, then the illusion of stability across the coastal belt would evaporate. ECOWAS's leadership knew what the public did not: many of their own institutions were far more fragile than they appeared. But the alliance was not acting alone. International actors have played a discreet yet decisive role in shaping the response. France, though weakened in the Sahel, remains deeply embedded along the coast. It maintains defense agreements, intelligence sharing arrangements, and economic partnerships that depend on a predictable political environment. The United States, which runs key surveillance operations and maritime security programs in the Gulf of Guinea, also relies on coastal stability. Western partners could not openly direct ECOWAS to intervene. But they did not need to. Their interests aligned perfectly with the bloc's panic. The Sahel may have been lost to a new political order, the AES bloc aligned with Russia and rejecting Western influence, but the coastline could not be allowed to fall. Ports, supply chains, energy corridors, and counterterrorism infrastructure all run through these coastal states. If Benin fell, or even looked like it might, it would signal that the coup belt had breached the final line. Western influence would shrink further. ECOWAS's authority would collapse. A region that once relied on international partnerships would shift decisively toward a new geopolitical center of gravity. This is the part of the story people often overlook. ECOWAS is not just a political bloc. It is an ecosystem of elite networks, presidents, business interests, regional financiers, and international partners, whose survival depends on preserving a specific balance of power. The Benin crisis threatened that balance. Not because Talon is uniquely important, but because losing another state would unravel the last thread holding the coastal coalition together. Within ECOWAS itself, there is another layer: the fear of contagion. Intelligence sources across West Africa have warned for years that military dissatisfaction is not isolated to the Sahel. Coastal armies are facing the same frustrations: low pay, weak equipment, corrupt procurement chains, and civilian governments that rely more on private influence than public legitimacy. If a successful coup happened in Benin, officers in Lomé, Accra, or even Abuja might begin to imagine their own opportunity. Political ambition spreads faster than conflict. All it needs is a model. That is why ECOWAS needed to send a message, a hard one, a fast one, one that could be understood in any barracks from Dakar to Lagos. When soldiers take power in landlocked Sahelian states, the alliance can condemn them and hope the situation burns itself out. But when soldiers take power near a port, near an international corridor, near the nodes of trade and diplomacy, the alliance sees an existential threat. Geography is destiny, and ECOWAS knows its destiny is tied to the sea. At the center of this network sits Patrice Talon, a president with powerful friends. He is a businessman with deep financial ties across the region. He is closely aligned with political elites in France. He maintains a stability that Western governments admire, even if opposition groups at home accuse him of shrinking democratic space. ECOWAS did not just rush to protect a president. It rushed to protect the economic ecosystem woven around him. But here is the irony: the more ECOWAS defends incumbents, the more it loses the moral legitimacy it claims to uphold. Citizens across West Africa saw the inconsistency. They remembered how ECOWAS sanctioned Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, imposing economic hardship on millions, yet never mobilized troops. They remembered the hollow threats and rhetorical condemnations. They watched as leaders extended term limits or manipulated electoral laws with barely a whisper of protest from the regional bloc. And then, suddenly, for Benin, a failed coup, no casualties, a few hours of chaos, ECOWAS activated an entire standby force. People noticed. Analysts noticed. Governments noticed. Because this was not a defense of democracy. It was a defense of the network that benefits from calling itself democratic while operating according to entirely different rules. And yet, the story does not end with Western influence or ECOWAS panic. There is a rival network rising, one that sees the Benin intervention not as a show of strength, but as a sign of desperation. The AES bloc, backed by Russia and fueled by popular anger against France and the United States, has built its identity on opposing ECOWAS's selective enforcement. In their narrative, Benin proved that the coastal states are now extensions of external interests, and that ECOWAS acts not as a regional guardian but as a political firewall. The battle lines were already drawn. Benin simply revealed them. When the coup attempt failed, ECOWAS celebrated the return to constitutional order. But beneath that celebration was something far more complex, the tightening grip of a regional elite. The visible hand of foreign influence, and the quiet realization that West Africa is entering an era where power is no longer negotiated softly. It is defended, aggressively, by whichever network can move fastest. And on December 7, the fastest network was not the military rebels. It was the system behind Patrice Talon. When the coup attempt in Benin collapsed, many assumed the danger had passed. But in a region as interconnected as West Africa, nothing ends where it begins. The fall of one domino is never just about one country. And the speed of ECOWAS's response revealed that the real battleground was not Benin at all. It was the entire coastal corridor stretching from Dakar to Lagos, a corridor that has become the final prize in a geopolitical contest reshaping Africa. The Sahel is already gone. Not in a literal sense, but in the political sense that matters. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have turned away from ECOWAS and embraced the AES alliance, a bloc that openly defies Western influence. Expels French troops, and seeks military partnerships with Russia. These shifts have fractured the old security architecture built over decades. In the past, the United States and France relied on Sahelian states to contain jihadist movements and maintain a buffer zone between North Africa and the Gulf of Guinea. Now that buffer is gone, replaced by a new axis of military juntas who see ECOWAS not as a partner, but as an adversary. This left the coastal states exposed. And exposure in West Africa carries consequences. Much of the region's economy flows through its ports, Cotonou, Tema, Abidjan, Lomé, Lagos. These ports are more than physical spaces. They are arteries. They carry oil, minerals, food supplies, imported goods, telecom infrastructure, and the invisible influence of whoever controls them. If a coup belt forms along the coastline, the geopolitical center of gravity shifts. Maritime security changes. Foreign investment flees. Intelligence networks break. Western militaries lose their most valuable footholds. This is why the Benin crisis triggered alarm well beyond the region. In Washington, the Gulf of Guinea is seen as one of the most strategically important maritime zones outside the Middle East. It is a corridor for oil shipments, anti-piracy operations, and regional surveillance systems. In Paris, Benin is part of the last stable arc where France still has political leverage after being forced out of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In Brussels, the European Union sees the coastal belt as a critical partner in migration control, trade, and counterterrorism. So when a coup attempt appeared at the gateway between the Sahel and the sea, these international actors did not see a small military rebellion. They saw a potential realignment, one that could tilt the entire coastline into a different orbit. The fear was not that Benin would suddenly join the AES bloc. The fear was that a successful coup would show coastal militaries that political change is possible, that ECOWAS is unable to stop it, and that Western-backed governments are vulnerable. A psychological shift like that spreads faster than any armed rebellion. For ECOWAS, the risk was even greater. If Benin fell, two consequences would follow almost immediately. First, every other coastal state would brace for its own shockwave. Second, the AES bloc would gain momentum, not through direct action, but through the logic of gravity. Political power moves toward whichever force looks ascendant. And in 2025, the momentum has not been on the side of ECOWAS. This is where the regional picture becomes global. Because West Africa is no longer a stage for local actors alone. The United States is expanding intelligence operations in Ghana and Nigeria. France is reinforcing partnerships in Côte d'Ivoire after losing bases in the Sahel. China continues building ports, industrial zones, and highways across the region through its Belt and Road strategy. Russia, meanwhile, is deepening military footprints through the AES governments, offering training, equipment, and political support with no lectures about term limits or governance. Three power centers, ECOWAS, the AES bloc, and external partners, are shaping a triangular contest. Benin was not the center of that triangle, but it was the hinge that kept it from collapsing inward. And the coup attempt threatened to knock that hinge loose. But the consequences were not only geopolitical. There is a social dimension that leaders often refuse to acknowledge. Across West Africa, public anger is growing. People are frustrated with unemployment, corruption, foreign dependency, and leaders who rewrite constitutions to stay in power. This anger fuels support for juntas in the Sahel. It fuels skepticism toward ECOWAS. It fuels narratives that claim only brute force can reset the political order. And when ECOWAS deployed troops for a failed coup in Benin, while doing nothing comparable in Niger, Mali, or Burkina Faso, that anger intensified. Some saw the response as hypocrisy. Others saw it as loyalty to Western interests. Many simply saw it as the latest proof that regional institutions protect elites, not citizens. If you believe this crisis is no longer about geography but about legitimacy, and you see the same pattern repeating, tell me in the comments. The broader truth is that West Africa is entering a period of strategic bifurcation. The region is splitting into two visions of the future. One vision believes stability comes from strong institutions, Western partnerships, and avoiding military takeovers at all costs. The other believes those institutions have already failed, that sovereignty means rejecting foreign models, and that new alliances must be built outside the Western orbit. Benin sits exactly where those visions collide. In the weeks following the attempted coup, foreign analysts downplayed the event. They treated it as a failed rebellion by a minor group of soldiers. But that is not how West Africans interpreted it. For them, the coup attempt in Benin felt like a test of what happens when the coup belt touches the ocean. The answer came swiftly, not through a political speech, but through the mobilization of real troops. That response did not restore confidence. It exposed how fragile the coastal order truly is. And now, every capital from Lomé to Lagos knows something it did not know before. ECOWAS will act, not to defend democracy broadly, but to defend a specific configuration of power. The AES bloc knows it too. And international actors are recalibrating their strategies around that reality. Benin was not just a failed coup. It was the unveiling of the new geopolitical map of West Africa. A map where alliances are brittle, institutions are distrusted, and the coastline has become the final frontier in a battle for influence that is no longer subtle. The question is not whether another domino will fall. It is which direction it will fall, and who will be ready to catch it. For weeks after the failed coup in Benin, the dominant narrative was simple: soldiers tried, the government resisted, ECOWAS reacted, and stability returned. But the more you peel back the layers, the less convincing that story becomes. Something about the speed, the coordination, and the confidence of the ECOWAS deployment felt too clean, too rehearsed, too ready. Stability does not usually appear that fast. Fear does. Preparation does. And protection, of a very specific kind, does. Here is the part almost no one talks about: the coup in Benin did not fail because it was weak. It failed because it was anticipated. Not in the sense of an intelligence leak a few hours before, but in the sense of a political system that had already built defenses long before the first shot was fired. Long before Tigre's men walked into the broadcaster, power networks around Talon had already prepared for the possibility of internal dissent. They had mapped out risk scenarios. They had identified pressure points inside the military. They had coordinated with ECOWAS on protocols for rapid stabilization, a phrase that appears in private diplomatic memos but almost never in public statements. When the coup began, the response did not feel improvised. It felt activated. This is where the twist becomes difficult to ignore. The failed coup in Benin was not simply crushed, it was contained. And containment is not what you do in a moment of panic. It is what you do when you already know the limits of the threat. Tigre's group never stood a chance, not because they were outnumbered, but because the system they were challenging had already anticipated their moves. ECOWAS did not save the Beninese government. It executed a playbook that had been quietly refined for months. And here lies the deeper question: if ECOWAS can mobilize troops within hours, why did it never do so for Niger, Mali, or Burkina Faso? The answer is uncomfortable. The bloc never prepared for those interventions because it never truly intended to make them. But for Benin, for the coastal belt, for the ports, for the last corridor of Western-aligned stability, it did prepare. And the coup attempt was the moment that preparation snapped into motion. This means something even more consequential. West Africa is no longer reacting to crises. It is staging around them. Governments are building defensive architectures not just to survive threats, but to signal their place within the region's emerging power blocks. And ECOWAS is part of that architecture, less a democratic institution and more a security service for the incumbents who anchor the coastal order. The twist is not that the coup failed. The twist is that it was never allowed to succeed. It was the wrong coup, in the wrong country, at the wrong moment in a geopolitical timeline where alliances are brittle and interests run deep. Tigre did not lose a battle. He walked into a trap designed long before he made his declaration on national television. And now, more than ever, West Africa must confront a truth it has tried to ignore: the line between defending democracy and defending power has blurred so completely that even experts struggle to tell the difference. When the dust settled in Cotonou, the government called it a victory for constitutional order. ECOWAS called it a warning to anyone who might try the same. But for millions watching across West Africa, the message landed differently. People did not see a triumph of democracy. They saw how quickly power can assemble to protect itself, and how slowly it moves when ordinary citizens are the ones in danger. In the end, the Benin coup attempt may be remembered not for what it changed, but for what it revealed. It showed a region standing at a crossroads, pulled between competing visions of sovereignty. Between alliances that promise stability and alliances that promise liberation, between leaders who speak of democracy and systems that rarely embody it. West Africa is writing a new chapter. But the question still hangs in the air, heavy and unresolved: who gets to shape that chapter, the people, or the networks that act in their name? If you believe these stories must be told, and that silence only serves the powerful, then like, comment, and subscribe. Not for me, but for everyone who still believes the truth should not need permission to be heard.